Corey Ray, written by Matthew Portillo. This short story is based on a true event. Raymond slowly grabs hold of the doorknob to his father's front door. His mouth gapes ever so slightly as he stares deeply into the door, his face covered in sweat and water from the melted snowflakes which had landed on his head and trickled down his forehead. For a moment, he considers turning around and simply leaving, leaning back slightly to move away from the front door. But as he thinks, the mental pain comes pouring back into his consciousness. He closes his eyes and swallows as he feels his saliva run down into his dry throat. He could remember every piercing sound, every dark yet vivid image. He felt if he had to live another day with this memory, he would break down. Ever since it happened, from the moment he did it, he promised himself he would keep it to himself and stay strong and quiet about it. He'd just gradually forget about it as though it had never happened, as he thought less and less about it. But it was impossible. He didn't realize the burden he would carry once he did it. It would just ring and ring in his mind forever. So he turns the doorknob and pushes the door open, trying to convince himself that this is the best thing he could do. As he steps into the mudroom, he could hear the TV playing in the distance. In the living room, to be exact, he knew his father was awake and watching TV. He kept trying to come up with an excuse to not have to do this. As much as he tried to take 2 steps forward, it seemed he would end up taking 3 steps back. Soon, he heard his father call out. "Hello?" he called out. Raymond felt shivers crawl up his entire body as he was startled by his father. He hesitated, but soon responded. "It's me, Dad." He then spontaneously began walking towards the living room. He decided that it would be done no matter how nervous or scared he felt. His father turns to look at him and notices the slight dread on his face. His body was facing the TV, but as he saw the concern on Raymond's face, he turned his entire body and attention on him, an expression of concern now painted on his face. "What happened?" Raymond's father asked. Raymond stared at his father, his mouth gaped open, trying to get the words out. His words felt clogged in his throat, like they were clinging onto his esophagus, trying their hardest not to leave his mouth. Finally, after what seemed like forever, the only words Raymond could muster up were, "I need to tell you something." Days prior, Raymond stood in front of the Owings household, his feet planted firmly on the snow-coated road, his footsteps marked behind him slightly. Leading up to where he currently stood, his head was tilted, staring at the window to his house, to the house. The right side of the window was covered by the peach-colored curtains, designed with bright beige flowers knitted into the curtain. To the left, which is where his eyes were fixated, he saw the stereo set he desired so strongly. He was not in the financial spot to be able to purchase his own, and he had become desperate ever since he saw it. The night was particularly dark, and small snowflakes whizzed through the air in a flash, like bullets. He was warming up to do it. After weeks of mental preparation, he decided what he would do was break in and steal it. He lifted his foot off of the ground and began towards the window. His footprints were marked in the snow now, the heat from his shoes having melted the snow and exposed the pavement buried underneath. He slowly grabs the lower sash of the window and slowly lifts it open, but struggles slightly as it felt stiff and stuck. Once he had created enough room in the window, he lifted his foot up and slipped it inside, followed by the rest of his body. Once he was inside the house, he stood up straight, looking at the stereo set. He had underestimated the size of it. It looked too big for him to carry out easily. He lifted his head up and looked around as something struck him as odd. The silence was ear-piercing. His ears rang as he figured nobody was home. He felt lucky, and his nerves settled slightly. He walked over to the stereo set and began disconnecting it from the wall. He wasn't being as cautious as he had been previously, but he was stopped dead in his tracks by a single word that came from the right side of himself. "Hello?" He looks over and sees a woman standing a few inches away from him. It was Margaret Owing, in her pajama shirt and pants, standing idly and staring at him, a confused and scared expression on her. In a fit of panic, Raymond lunges towards her, pulling out a large kitchen knife he had hidden in his coat pocket, gripping it tightly. He jabbed at her neck. The knife pierces into her Adam's apple, plunges into her neck, and just barely comes out from the back of her neck. Margaret gasped slightly as she felt the cold steel knife bury into her throat. She attempted to scream, but instead a sharp cough splattering blood onto Raymond's face. He shuts his eyes slightly as he felt the warm, wet blood sprinkle onto his face and trickle down to his chin. He quickly pulls the knife out, then stabs her in the chest. She slightly keels forward, the fresh wound from her throat pouring blood. Raymond's hand was shaking, his heart pounding like a drum. Margaret continued to try and scream, but it was as if Raymond had completely taken her ability to speak. She then falls forward, right onto Raymond. He exclaims as he backs away quickly, knocking the back of his body against the wall behind him. Her body slams onto the floor, splashing a long puddle of blood on the cold wooden tiles. Her mouth moves like a fish, blood gushing from her wounds as her eyes stare far beyond the gaze of death. To ensure she would not survive, he kneels down to stab her in the head, precisely in the back of the head. He jabs down and hears a slight crack as the knife breaks through her skull and pierces her brain. Her entire body jolts upwards violently as she mumbles in pain. He begins twisting the knife around while it is still in her head, mixing around her brain and broken fragments of her skull. After a few seconds, he notices she isn't moving anymore. He stands up, leaving the knife in her head, as he grabs her by her ankles and begins dragging her across the living room, entering the kitchen and approaching the backyard door. Holding onto her right ankle still, he leans backwards and opens the door fully, then continuing to drag the body, leaving a thick, long trail of blood and chunks of thick, jelly-like clots of blood, which had been vomited by Margaret and were seeping out of her mouth. He goes outside and stops for a second. As he looks around, he notices the neighboring forest beside the house. He turns around to face away from the body and drags it behind himself. As he walks along the concrete, Margaret's mouth stays agape, causing her teeth to loudly scrape across the concrete. As Raymond walks down the steps, her face slams down each step. When her head hits the final step, her right front tooth breaks off from her gums, spraying a spew of blood onto the step and leaving the bloody tooth behind. Once they reach the woods, he drops her feet onto the grass in between some tall trees. He turns around and quickly makes for the house. He goes back through the door, through the living room, and down the hallway Margaret had come from. He opens each door and scopes around inside the rooms, looking for something else he might like to steal. Finally, he reaches a door with colorful foam letters adorning it, reading Corey's room. Curious, he opens the door. The first thing to catch his eyes was a big white baby crib. He slowly creeps up to it, and inside was 16-month-old Corey Ray, sleeping soundly on her back. She wore tiny socks on her hands and was in a pink, fluffy onesie. Beside her was a stuffed pink giraffe covered in white spots, resting on her left arm. As she snores slightly, she makes small cooing noises. She must be having a dream, Raymond thought to himself. He rests his hands on the rail of the crib, looking down at her, motionless. Eventually, he reaches down and pushes the stuffed giraffe away from her arm and slowly picks her up. As he holds her in both arms, cradling her, as she slightly rubs her face with her sock mittens, whining slightly. He turns around and walks out of the room with her, down the hallway, through the kitchen and out the back door. The cold snow begins to fall down on Corey, and the freezing air hits her as well. She starts to whine, and then she wakes up and begins to cry. He makes his way over to Margaret and places the baby beside her. Corey rolls over and looks at her dead mother. While crying, she slowly reaches her small hand out to her mother and places it on her blood-coated cheek. She had no idea she was staring at her mother's dead body. All she wanted was to be hugged by her mother and to be given warm kisses and snuggles by her mother, who loved her baby greatly. Even after death, Margaret's soul cried out for her baby. Even in death, she worried for her safety. Baby Corey crawls over and hugs her mother's face, continuously sobbing as her face was getting stained with blood. Raymond returns with a rusty shovel and digs it into the ground and begins to dig. He simply ignores the baby's cries. He continues to dig, making the hole bigger and bigger, enough for an adult to fit into. He stands back once he finishes, content with his new grave. He drops the shovel onto the ground and then walks towards the baby, still latched onto her mother's face. He leans down and grabs Corey by the waist and rips them apart. Corey's cries were louder. He walks back to the hole and positions the baby above it. He stares at her for a bit, and then he lets go of her midair. Corey plummets down and slams into the hole, thudding loudly and slamming her head against the dirt. Her eyes widen slightly as the pain settles in. She opens her mouth and shrieks loudly, now screaming instead of simply sobbing. Cries so loud they pierced Raymond's ears, and not only that, but his soul, ripping into his skin. Raymond walks over to Margaret's body. He plants his foot onto the side of her body and pushes her into the hole. He hears the baby gag slightly as she was being crushed by her own mother's body. This embrace was not one of love, but of pain. Her screams become stifled as she struggles as hard as a baby can, but her entire body was being crushed between the dirt and her mother. Raymond grabs the shovel and begins to dump the dirt back into the hole, sealing Margaret and Corey into the earth. Once the hole was sealed underneath the dirt and snow, he turns around to face the house. He listens to the muffled struggles of the small baby grow weaker and weaker. It got to the point where it sounded like a squeaky toy was being perpetually squeezed. Then, finally, silence. Raymond dry heaves as he realizes the agonizing bite of guilt. The cries of Corey were slowly and actively being seared into his brain like a hot iron being pressed onto his mind. At this point, the stereo set did not matter. The valuables still sitting in the Owens household did not matter. The world becomes silent for just a second. Raymond stands still, staring at the house. Emotions rupture inside of Raymond, bursting like blood vessels. They all accumulated inside of him. It felt as if they would all spill out of him in screams and cries. Yet, he says nothing. If he had a gun, he would blow his brains out at that very moment. Instead, he walks back to the house much slower than he had earlier. In the midst of his racing mind, he figured he must clean up. and clean up meant wiping down every single surface he recalled touching with his bare skin. The window, the crib, the toy giraffe, the stereo, the backyard door. Everything was thoroughly wiped with a damp rag. He scurried back and forth, trying his best to remember everything he had touched. He furiously scrubs the shovel, wrapping his left hand with the sleeve of his coat in order to keep it steady. The entire time he had been darting his eyes around to make sure absolutely no one was seeing. He realized his fingerprints were all over the bodies. He considered digging them up, but oh God, he couldn't. If he had to see that damn baby one more time. Hopefully their bodies would crust and rot beyond recognition. The maggots and worms would pick apart their bodies and leave nothing but dirty white skeletons that would also decompose, and everything would be gone forever. It was the perfect murder. Raymond's father stares at his son in disbelief. His face was facing slightly forward, as if trying to look away from him. Raymond had both hands cupped over his mouth, his thumbs sticking straight up and trembling, his eyes shut so tightly. Tears leak out from between his eyelids. He inhales through his nostrils. His father closes his mouth and swallows. At that moment, he didn't know how he felt about his own son. He didn't know whether to weep or to feel sorry or to angrily beat down on him with the rage of not only himself but of Margaret and whatever subconscious hatred little Corey had for him. He would beat his son so hard he would die. He would beat him so hard he himself would have a heart attack and die with him. But instead, he closed his eyes. His face and eyes felt sore. "Dear God, Raymond," he says softly. He faces to look at him. He realizes Raymond can't even look at him. He purses his lips slightly. "Look at me," he says, containing his rage. Raymond did not even move his pupils. Raymond's father's eyes widened, and he raised his head up and shouted as loudly as he could, "Look at me!" Raymond gasps sharply and looks at him, breathing heavily and rapidly. His father now stares at him angrily. He could no longer have patience with him anymore. He could not be merciful. "What you need to do is turn yourself into the police." Raymond's shoulders lower slightly, his mouth still agape. He stared at his father and stutters, "What?" "You heard me. You have to do it. You're a criminal and a murderer, but you stole my son. Which is why I'm asking you to do this, for your own good." They both stare at each other for a good few seconds. Raymond just gets up and stares at his father. "I'm tired." He turns around and disappears into the darkness of the hallway. Raymond's father sits alone and processes. He knew damn well his son would not have the balls to turn himself in for such a brutal crime. He covers his eyes with the palm of his hands as his lips quivered. He felt pain, mentally and physically. He puts his hand over his chest as he feels his heart race. He was afraid. He was afraid of many things and sad for many things. He inhaled shakily as he was being hit with the realization of everything. He cried for Margaret, for the baby, for his son. If Raymond could not do it, he would have to. He loved his son, but would he really let him walk free after hearing this? He regretted hearing his story, but at the same time, he felt glad his son had told him. He had to stop him before he would do some horrible thing like this again. Thoughts filled his mind of the past. He thought of any signs that could have been warnings or hints to his son becoming a murderer, any small details he might have brushed past, any little fucking minuscule detail. Nothing. Raymond had always been a good child. Sure, he was rebellious, but practically every child is. Raymond had never willingly killed any small creature or insect or any of the sort. This was just out of spite. The human instinct. He looks over to his left at the small desk sitting beside the couch. The phone was right there, and nothing, absolutely nothing, was stopping him from turning his son in. He slowly leans over and picks up the phone off of the receiver. He puts it against his ears. The droning dead hum from the other end beamed into his ear. He leaned over once more and slowly pressed the numbers on the keypad. 911. He waited as the phone rang. He waited and waited. He looks over at the hallway. The darkness poured out of the corners of the hallway's door frame. He feared Raymond may jump out at him and kill him. But he figured he would be safer now. As Raymond lay in his father's bed, he could do anything but sleep. His eyes stayed wide open as he stared into the wall. His entire life has been altered for the worst. He knows that in that moment, his life will never be the same. Even if they lock him up, he would be locked up with the piercing shrieks and vivid memories of that day. Even if he sought therapy, even the strongest of sessions would not be enough to wash his mind. Even if he burned in hell for all eternity, even if he screamed so loud until he tore his vocal cords, even if he smashed his head against rocks until his mind shattered, the screams of the dead are far louder than evil itself. And then he heard the sirens. And that is my reading of my original story, Corey Ray. This was a very different thing to do and a very awkward thing to do. This is the very first audiobook type of video I've ever made in my life. And I think it went pretty well, personally. There were parts where I did stutter, obviously, and I didn't read some things correctly, and some things may seem disjointed and whatnot, but that's pretty much just because of me. This is a beginner's thing, really. So yeah, thank you guys so much for listening to my story. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and that was the story of Corey Ray. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.